Hey, this is Joel Cameron. Thanks for joining me for another video on mixing drums. In this particular video, I'm going to deal with the hi-hat. Hi-hat is an interesting element, and you would think maybe, do you need a whole video to talk about how to process the hi-hat? Well, yes, I think you do. Typically in modern studio setups, we wind up putting a spot mic on the hi-hat directly, give it its own mic. As a mix engineer, I often don't use a whole lot of it, particularly if there's space within the mix that allows me to get most of what I need out of the hi-hat from the overhead mics. On denser mixes, I sometimes need that spot mic to give it more definition. But the louder you use that spot mic, there's a couple of things that are problematic. And one is if it was mic'd poorly, if the position of the mic was such that it's actually pointed. Oftentimes people put it pretty high off the hi-hat to let it breathe, which I'm normally a fan of letting things breathe, but if it's too high off the hi-hat, then oftentimes it's looking fairly straight down on the snare drum and you get a lot of leakage. So if you wind up using much hi-hat, you also wind up getting this sort of phasey snare response that's fighting the close mic of the snare as well. That's not the case in this particular clip that I have, as the hi-hat itself, as you can hear, is actually the dominant thing. Even though you can hear the snare drum, the hat's really the dominant element that's being heard by the mic. So that's appropriate. But still, there's another problem when I want to use a lot of this, and I'll show you what that is. Again, remember, the hat's generally a riding element, a tambourine, a shaker kind of thing. The kick and the snare really own the groove. So I'm going to start this out with the hi-hat low, and you'll see the kick and the snare own the groove, which they do. Now I want more hi-hat. Watch what happens. Or listen. Now that's not terrible, but listen to the backbeat. Okay, I'm gonna start at the beginning again, so we got the hi-hat portion of the groove. Listen to the snare drum and the hat together. There's a lot of hat there. Now the drummer's pretty solid, and the hat and snare are hitting pretty consistently together, but that's a lot of hat. And so if you bring up the hat where it's really strong, it's going to stay strong. And I don't really want that to compete with the snare drum personally. I want to give room for the snare drum, but when the snare drum's not playing, let the hat go ahead and have its space. So to do that, I am once again going to reach for a compressor. And I'm going to once again sidechain. I love to sidechain. I do lots and lots of sidechaining. If you've watched these videos, you see that I spend more time probably sidechaining than almost anything else. I'm using bus 32 for the top of the snare drum. I'm going to use the snare drum send. Again, this is a pre-fader send. I want to send this to the compressor so that when the snare drum hits, it's going to compress or reduce, basically, gain reduction, reduce the level of the hi-hat. And I'm going to use a really fast attack, sort of like I do with noise gates, so that I'm making sure I'm biting off the front of the transient of the hi-hat. And I do want a fairly quick release as well, because as soon as the snare drum attack passes and the hi-hat attack is brought down, I want it to release really quickly, so fast that I don't even notice that it was really compressed, and it allows all the rest of the hi-hat stuff to stick through. So just making those two changes to the attack and release, and then sidechain. Oh, I got to click my sidechain. And sidechain off the snare. Listen to the difference. Now look at that. Look at this reduction here. Got 12-ish reduction, dB of reduction when that thing hits. So let me bypass it. And again, back in. Now this isn't a hi-hat portion of the groove. It's on the right cymbal, and you can hear the hi-hat being played with the foot pedal. But it still works to do that, because that means the hi-hat's not leaking. The snare leakage and whatnot into the hi-hat mic is being controlled still, even when you're not actually playing the hi-hat. It really does clean things up a lot. Now 12 dB is it's pretty huge. You can reduce that by using a lower ratio or by raising the threshold. Either way, I don't really care which. This works real well for me. Now, that's nice and loud. It's really louder than I would probably actually use. But then again, if there's a lot of high, mid, and crunchy guitars and things like that in the mix, I might have it this loud so that you can really hear the hi-hat. But there's one other thing that I want to do to this. It sounds pretty good, but if you listen to the hi-hat, this particular hi-hat, or perhaps the mic with which it was recorded, it gives it a real metallic-y character. Well, hold off on that thought. First and foremost, let me just put an EQ in. I'm going to EQ it after the compressor. The first thing I'm going to do, this hi-hat, it's a high-frequency instrument. There's really nothing in the way of low frequencies that we want in it, so I'm going to go in and put on a high-pass filter. Now you're thinking, that sounds like a hi-hat. There's not a lot of low-frequency information. Ha, ha, ha. But listen, as I sweep. Isn't that amazing? Bypass. All that low-frequency information has nothing to do with the hi-hat. And to the extent that it's really audible or contributes to the overall mix of the drums, it's really probably going to do more to cause phasiness or a blurred image. So I want to get rid of that. Another benefit of getting rid of the low end that you don't need with a high-pass filter is that it does technically actually give you a little bit more level in hand, a little bit more headroom, so you can push the faders up more and come up with a louder sounding mix before you have to reach for compression or whatever. So listening to that, I've got this solo to show you. I don't generally recommend that you make change, do EQing and filtering without it in the mix. So in the mix, I'm going to play with it some more. And I don't mind it all the way up there. Bypass. It's just a little bit crisper. Now this particular hi-hat, what I was saying before is that the hat or the mic used or the preamp or something, placement, whatever, is giving it kind of a bright metallic-y kind of sound. Obviously, it's two big discs of metal that are banging together with a drumstick. So it's going to be a fairly aggressive sound, and usually, particularly with solid-state mics, the closer that you get, a lot of times you can get a really kind of a metallic, almost resonance or ring or something that really makes it aggressive, particularly with cheaper microphones. So I know a lot of people, sort of the first thing that they do, they want that to be bright, and they'll start cranking up the high end and stuff. No, 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 no. Again, I'm a subtractive guy. I'm going to take out what I don't like. That's metallic-y sounding to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pull it back a few dB, and I'm going to sweep until that metallicness goes away. Somewhere up in there. I like it up higher, actually. And that's a lot of reduction. I'm not talking that much. Hear it? And that actually allows me to, I could bring it up some more. And then maybe go back and use a little bit more reduction. Go ahead and raise that ratio up again. So now it's contained, but it's real clear. You can hear it. So by using compression, sidechain compression off the snare drum, which is generally the element that leaks most into the hi-hat and that the hat is generally competing with. You have a bright hi-hat and a low, kick drum. The hi-hat doesn't tend to compete in a bad way with the kick drum. It actually sort of complements the character of a kick drum, but it often does because of the brightness of a snare drum. And a lot of times it can get in the way. And so this is a useful way of containing it so that the snare remains the dominant part of the groove, and yet the hi-hat, when the snare is not playing, is still entirely natural and clear, and you can pan it to where you want it and all that kind of stuff. So I hope this is helpful. Please visit my recording blog. It's joelsmixup.blogspot.com for more tips on all kinds of things recording related. So thank you very much. I appreciate you watching.